Design harmony standards. I remember thinking how ridiculous that sounded for a patch of land surrounded by trees, far from the rows of identical homes deeper in the neighborhood. But I nodded, thanked her for the note, and promised to attend the meeting. When I showed up at the clubhouse that evening, the atmosphere was tense. The board members sat behind a folding table like judges at a hearing, with Marjorie at the center. They asked about the shed, my long-term plans for the property, and whether I'd received official approval before starting work. I explained everything, that I'd reviewed the HOA documents, that my plot was technically outside their direct development zone, and that the shed was temporary. But I could tell they weren't listening. They didn't like that someone had moved in on the edge of their perfect little world. After the meeting, I left feeling uneasy. I'd done nothing wrong, but I had the distinct sense I'd just been marked as a problem. In the weeks that followed, the letters started showing up. Requests for documentation, courtesy warnings, and eventually fines. Each one was more aggressive than the last, accusing me of non-compliance and unauthorized construction. I tried reasoning with them, sending copies of my land deed and county zoning maps, but nothing seemed to slow them down. The funny thing was, the more they pushed, the more I started digging into my property's history. The paperwork, the surveys, the easements. I wanted to understand exactly what I owned and where their authority ended. And that's when I found something that changed everything. Because buried in a decades-old zoning document, I discovered that my small piece of land wasn't just adjacent to the community's lake reserve, it actually included the only strip of land that led to it. The very path every homeowner used to reach their lake was mine. I sat there staring at the map, heart pounding, realizing how big this was. They'd been threatening me over a shed, completely unaware that their beloved lake access, their prized community feature, was legally part of my property. And at that moment, I stopped feeling powerless. I stopped feeling like the outsider they wanted to control, because suddenly, I held the one thing the HOA couldn't afford to lose. After discovering that I owned the narrow strip of land that connected Willow Creek Estates to their private lake, something in me shifted. What had started as confusion turned into quiet resolve. For weeks, the HOA had been treating me like a nuisance, an outsider who didn't belong. Now I realized I had been holding the trump card all along. But I didn't act immediately. I wanted to be smart, patient. I'd seen how quickly an HOA could twist things when they felt cornered. So I stayed polite. I kept the property neat, paid my dues, and pretended to play along, all while quietly gathering every piece of paperwork, every map, every letter they'd sent me. Then one morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice stapled to my gate. Notice of violation, unauthorized structure, non-compliant materials. They'd fined me for $250 for the shed again, even after I'd provided all documentation showing it was temporary and within my property boundaries. The letter claimed I had 7 days to correct the violation or face legal action. That was when I decided to stop letting them push me around. I drafted a calm but firm email to Marjorie, attaching the county property survey and the zoning map that clearly outlined the lake access path, all of it shaded within my parcel's borders. My message was simple. Before taking further action, please confirm your understanding of where the HOA's jurisdiction ends. No threats, no anger, just facts. Her reply came the next day. One sentence. Our board will review this matter further. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The harassment escalated fast. A week later, I noticed a couple of HOA board members walking near the edge of my property, pointing at things, jotting notes on clipboards. They didn't wave, they didn't speak, they just stood there like they were inspecting enemy territory. Then came the second fine, this time for improper landscaping. They claimed my lot didn't meet the community's aesthetic standards. I laughed out loud when I read it. My lot was mostly undeveloped land and trees. They were literally fining me for nature. But the fines weren't what got to me. It was the pettiness, the feeling that no matter what I did, they'd find something to complain about. Neighbors I'd once chatted with started keeping their distance. Word spread that I was refusing to cooperate with the HOA. Some even believed I was planning to block the community from using the lake, a rumor I hadn't started, but one that Marjorie certainly hadn't tried to stop. And then came the meeting. They sent a mandatory appearance notice, something that sounded official but wasn't. It stated that my ongoing noncompliance required a formal hearing before the board. I decided to show up, but this time I wasn't walking in unprepared. I arrived early, carrying a folder thick with every piece of evidence I'd gathered. The meeting started in the usual way, Marjorie reading off violations, another board member listing supposed community complaints. I let them talk. I let them build their case. Then, when they asked if I had anything to add, I stood, walked up to their table, and laid out the property documents. "This," I said, pointing to the county seal on the survey, "is the official record of my parcel. The HOA's property line ends here. Everything past this line, including the access to the lake, belongs to me." You could have heard a pin drop. Marjorie's face went pale. She leaned forward, scanning the map like she was hoping to find a typo. "This must be a mistake," she said. "The lake is part of the common area." I shook my head. "No, the lake is public, but your community's only access point isn't. It was never formally transferred. The developer missed that step when the HOA was formed. I confirmed it with the county." A murmur went through the room. One of the board members whispered something under his breath. Another started flipping through his notes. Marjorie's voice rose, sharp and defensive. "You're telling me you believe you own the community's lake entrance?" "I don't believe it," I said. "I know it." And that's when things got ugly. She accused me of trying to blackmail the HOA, said I was using loopholes to gain leverage over the neighborhood. I could feel the hostility building, not just from the board, but from some of the residents in the room. To them, I wasn't a neighbor anymore. I was a threat. I left the meeting without another word. I knew nothing I said would change their minds that night. Within days, the retaliation started. One morning I found tire tracks cutting across my property, deep ruts leading from the main road straight down to the lake. Someone had ignored my no trespassing sign and driven right through. A few days later, I caught two teenagers fishing on the dock and told them politely that they were on private land. They looked at me like I was insane. "Marjorie said we could," one of them said, before running off. That's when I realized she wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. The next HOA newsletter that went out to residents included a section titled Lake Access Clarification. It said in bold print, "Recent misinformation about community lake access is being spread by an individual who is not acting in good faith with the HOA. Please disregard any false claims of private ownership." They didn't use my name, but everyone knew exactly who it was about. My inbox filled with angry messages. Some were passive-aggressive, others outright threatening. One said, "If you try to take away our lake, we'll make sure you regret it." I filed a report with the sheriff's office, just in case. That's when I decided to draw a line, literally. I had a small fence installed along the access path, with a locked gate at the entrance. I posted a simple sign, "Private property. no HOA access without permission. Within hours, my phone lit up. Calls, texts, voicemails, all from neighbors, all furious. Marjorie even showed up at my driveway waving a letter. She shouted that I was violating community easement rights and disrupting neighborhood harmony. I calmly handed her a copy of the county's land record. "There is no recorded easement," I told her. "If you think otherwise, show me the paperwork." She didn't have any. She stormed off, yelling that the board would take this to the highest level. A few days later, I got a certified letter from an attorney representing the HOA. It was full of legal jargon, threatening to file an injunction to force me to remove the fence. They accused me of obstructing community property and creating a hostile environment. But the thing about paper threats, they only work if you don't know your rights. I hired my own lawyer, a calm older man who dealt with plenty of HOA cases. He reviewed the documents, then smiled. He said, "They're bluffing. They don't have a leg to stand on. If they push this, they'll lose, and it'll cost them." So we sent our own letter in response, short, direct, and devastatingly clear. Any further harassment or trespass on my client's property will be met with legal action. This includes unauthorized use of the access path. For a few weeks, things went quiet. No fines, no letters, no surprise visits. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd realized it wasn't worth the fight. But I underestimated how far some people will go to protect their illusion of control. One Saturday morning, I looked out my window and saw a small group gathered by the fence. Marjorie, 2 board members, and a couple of neighbors. They were arguing with a county official. I walked over, keeping calm. The official turned to me and said they'd received a complaint that I was blocking a public right-of-way. He was polite, but I could tell he'd been fed a story. I showed him the survey, the legal documents, everything. He studied them, nodded slowly, and finally said, "Mr. Daniels is correct. This is private property." Marjorie's face went crimson. She turned and stormed off without another word, leaving the rest of the group standing there in stunned silence. That night I sat on my porch, the sound of crickets in the distance, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Because while I'd won that round, I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. People like Marjorie don't accept defeat. They scheme, they twist, they find new angles. And sure enough, just when I thought things were settling down, another letter arrived. This time it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county zoning office. Apparently someone had filed an anonymous complaint claiming that my shed violated environmental setback regulations, a thinly veiled attempt to get the county to step in where the HOA couldn't. I felt my stomach drop. It was clever, underhanded but clever. They couldn't beat me through HOA rules, so now they were trying to use the law itself against me. And that's when I realized this wasn't about a shed or a fence or even a lake. It was about power. And the HOA wasn't done fighting for it. Weeks had passed since the HOA's last letter, and for a moment I'd allowed myself to believe the storm had passed. But the day that white pickup truck rolled down my driveway, the county seal on the door and a clipboard in his hand, I knew the HOA had found another way to strike. He was professional, polite, but distant. "We've received a complaint," he said, scanning the property. "Apparently there's an unpermitted structure built within environmental setback limits." He meant the shed, the same shed they'd been obsessing over since day one. I handed him every document I had. The plot plan, the building code references, proof it was temporary. He nodded, took photos, and said he'd file his report. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Off the record, Mr. Daniels, whoever's coming after you, they're persistent." Persistent. That was one word for it. The next week, I received a citation notice. Small fine, easily appealable, but enough to trigger a public hearing. A hearing that would be open to residents, which meant one thing: the HOA would show up. I didn't sleep the night before the hearing. My mind replayed every letter, every knock on my door, every neighbor who'd turned their back on me because of Marjorie's whispers. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could bully me into submission. When I arrived at the county office, the parking lot was already half full. And sure enough, right there by the entrance stood Marjorie, clipboard in hand, surrounded by half the HOA board. They weren't here for civic duty. They were here for blood. The hearing room felt smaller than it was. Fluorescent lights, long tables, and the faint hum of the air conditioner that couldn't quite drown out the tension. The inspector presented his findings first, calm, factual, unbiased. He confirmed the shed's position, noted the complaint, and acknowledged my provided documentation. Then Marjorie stood up. She spoke with that same self-righteous tone she'd used since the day we met, the voice of someone who had never been told no. "This property has been a continuous problem for our community," she declared, her voice sharp and cutting. "We have countless violations, ongoing disputes, and now environmental damage caused by improper construction near our shared lake." Shared lake. I almost laughed. But I stayed quiet. My lawyer had told me to keep calm, to let her dig her own grave. And she was doing it beautifully. She went on, accusing me of threatening neighbors, blocking community access, and creating hostility within Willow Creek Estates. Each sentence was another swing of the hammer, and she didn't realize she was hitting her own thumb. When she finally finished, the hearing officer looked to me. "Mr. Daniels, do you wish to respond?" I stood up, my hands steady, my voice calm. I laid out the same documents I'd shown the HOA months earlier: the property survey, the zoning record, the chain of ownership. I spoke clearly, explaining that my structure was temporary, compliant, and built fully within my own land. Then I pulled out one more piece of paper, the one that would change everything. "This," I said, handing it to the officer, "is a notarized copy of the original developer's land transfer record from 1997. It confirms that the HOA never legally obtained rights to the lake access strip. That land has remained privately owned since before Willow Creek Estates was even established." The room went silent. The officer took his time reading through it. Marjorie's face flushed deep red, her jaw tightening as she realized where this was going. After what felt like an eternity, the officer spoke. "Based on this documentation," he said, looking up, "it appears the complaint is invalid. The structure is within compliance, and there's no evidence of environmental violation. Additionally," he glanced toward the HOA group, "any community use of the lake access without permission from the property owner could be considered trespassing." The words hit like thunderclap. Marjorie stammered, trying to interrupt, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, this is not an HOA proceeding. The county has no authority over your internal disputes. As far as we're concerned, this matter is closed." She froze. The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. I could feel their eyes on me, a mix of shock, anger, and something else. Fear. I turned to leave, and as I passed Marjorie, she muttered under her breath, "You'll regret this." But for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt free. The next day, everything changed. Word spread fast, faster than I could have imagined. The official report from the hearing was public record, and within hours, neighbors began talking. Some were angry at Marjorie for misleading them. Others were embarrassed, realizing they'd backed the wrong side. Then came the bombshell. At the next HOA meeting, several board members resigned. One even apologized to me privately, saying he didn't know the full story. But Marjorie refused to step down. She doubled down, sending out desperate emails, claiming there'd been a misinterpretation of the county's ruling. But no one was buying it anymore. The HOA's authority, once absolute, was crumbling. Meanwhile, I took my own quiet step, filing an official no trespassing order for the lake access path. I didn't block it completely, I simply required written permission for use, a fair, legal boundary. The irony? Within a week, I started receiving polite requests from the same people who'd once cursed my name. Families wanted to fish, kids wanted to swim, and I allowed them, under one condition: no HOA involvement. And just like that, the community began to realize something Marjorie never had, that cooperation and respect worked better than control and intimidation. But Marjorie wasn't done. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I noticed headlights pulling up near the fence. A car door slammed, followed by angry footsteps crunching through gravel. It was her. She stood by the gate, shouting across the property line, "You can't keep doing this! You're destroying this community!" I walked closer, stopping a safe distance away. "Marjorie, the only thing that was destroying this community was your ego." Her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You'll see how quickly people turn on you." And maybe she was right, but I didn't care. Because for the first time since I'd moved to Willow Creek, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I watched as she stormed off, her car fishtailing down the gravel road. It was almost poetic. The woman who had once ruled this neighborhood like a queen, now unraveling in her own fury. A week later, I received a final letter, this time not from Marjorie, but from the HOA's legal representative. They were dissolving the board. After multiple resignations, dwindling membership, and irreconcilable community division, the HOA had voted to disband. The neighborhood would return to county management, and all HOA dues would cease. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The same organization that had spent months trying to crush me was gone. That night, I walked down the path to the lake. The air was still, the water glassy and calm. I stood there for a long time, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the surface. I thought about the months of letters, the threats, the stress, about how a group of people desperate for control had turned a peaceful place into a battlefield. And then I thought about what it took to end it. Not rage, not revenge, but proof, patience, boundaries. Marjorie had tried to rule with fear, but all it took was truth to undo her power. As I turned to head back home, I noticed something new at the end of my fence, a small handwritten note tucked between the boards. It wasn't official, no header land, just plain paper and black ink. "You did the right thing. Thank you for standing up to them." No signature, but somehow that made it mean even more. I slipped it into my pocket and smiled, because maybe, just maybe, peace was finally returning to Willow Creek Estates. But even as calm returned to the neighborhood, the aftermath of that fight, the lessons learned, and the quiet scars it left behind were just beginning to reveal themselves. After the HOA dissolved, Willow Creek Estates felt different, quieter, almost weightless. It took a few weeks for the news to truly settle in. One day, the signs at the entrance that read Willow Creek Estates, managed by the HOA, were taken down. The emails stopped. The warnings stopped. The monthly reminders about dues and community standards disappeared from our mailboxes like a bad dream finally fading. But what surprised me most wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. For the first time since I'd moved in, I could wake up, step outside, and breathe without tension curling in my stomach. The lake shimmered in the morning light like it was exhaling too, no longer trapped behind bureaucracy or power games. Neighbors started smiling again. Some waved from across their driveways. Others came by, hesitant at first, unsure how I'd react. But I didn't hold grudges. I'd learned by then that anger, no matter how justified, can only weigh you down when you've already won. A few days after the HOA officially disbanded, I found an envelope taped to my front gate. Inside was a single handwritten note. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You were right. T. The T could have been anyone. One of the board members, a neighbor, maybe even the treasurer who'd resigned during the fallout. Whoever it was, the gesture mattered more than the name. It was the first real sign that people were finally seeing what had happened for what it truly was, not rebellion, but resistance against something toxic that had gone unchecked for too long. And as much as I'd wanted to put the entire ordeal behind me, there were still reminders scattered across the neighborhood. The broken trust, the faded paint lines where HOA notices used to hang, the whispers that still echoed about how it all went down. But over time, the whispers faded too, because once the power was gone, the fear went with it. Without the HOA, residents had to adjust. There were no more mandatory lawn inspections, no fines for leaving a garbage can out too long, no color swatches for acceptable fence paint. At first, some people worried the place would fall apart, that without control, the community would crumble. But that didn't happen. Instead, something better took its place. A small group of neighbors, people who'd once quietly disagreed with Marjorie but never felt brave enough to speak up, started a volunteer committee. Not an HOA, just neighbors helping neighbors. They organized cleanups, coordinated shared maintenance for the park area, and even set up a community picnic by the lake. The same lake that had nearly torn everyone apart. And they invited me to it. I almost didn't go. For months I'd been the center of every rumor and argument in that place. But something in me knew I needed to. So I showed up, unsure what kind of reception I'd get. To my surprise, it wasn't awkward at all. People were kind, genuine. Kids played by the water again. Someone grilled burgers, another handed out lemonade. A few folks even came by to thank me quietly, not for winning, but for standing up when everyone else was too afraid to. That meant more to me than any legal victory could have. Because in the end, it wasn't about property lines or paperwork. It was about showing that no one person, no group, should have unchecked power over others simply because they say so. As for Marjorie, she'd disappeared from the picture not long after the dissolution. Word was she'd sold her house and moved out of state to live with her daughter. No farewell party, no goodbye note, just gone. Part of me expected to feel triumphant about that, some kind of vindication. But instead, I just felt sad. Because beneath the layers of control and arrogance, I think Marjorie truly believed she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting the community from chaos. But somewhere along the way, she forgot what community actually meant. It's not rules. It's not fines. It's not power. It's people. And maybe that's why so many HOAs end up the same way. People chasing control until they lose sight of connection. A few months later, the county officially transferred maintenance of the common spaces back to residents through voluntary agreements. I helped with some of the paperwork, ironic considering I'd once been their biggest problem. That's when I decided to make one final change to my property. The fence along the lake path was still there, solid, quiet, a symbol of everything I'd endured. But now I added something new, a small wooden gate with a sign above it that read, "Welcome. Please respect the land you walk on." No locks, No threats, just trust. And it worked. People came, fished, swam, laughed, and left it as clean as they found it. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The difference was night and day. When control was replaced by respect, everything just worked. One evening, I stood by the lake again, the water calm, the air thick with the sound of crickets. It was almost poetic how still it all felt after months of chaos. I watched the ripples spread from a single stone tossed into the water and thought about how far one small act can reach. Buying that little piece of land had seemed like such a simple thing. A fresh start, a chance to build something of my own. But that decision had unknowingly shaken an entire system, exposing how fragile control becomes when it's built on fear and ego. If I'd known back then what I know now, would I have still bought it? Honestly, yes. Because what I learned through it all was worth far more than any fine or sleepless night. I learned that boundaries, physical or otherwise, mean nothing if you don't stand by them. I learned that silence, even when it feels safe, only gives power to the wrong people. And, most importantly, I learned that sometimes the fight you never asked for becomes the lesson you most needed. Today, Willow Creek feels like a different place entirely. The lawns aren't perfect anymore, but the people are happier. The rules are fewer, but the respect runs deeper. And every time I see a family walking down that path to the lake, I smile, because I know how much it took for them to be able to do that freely. Not under the watch of a committee, not by permission of a president, but simply as neighbors. If there's one thing I hope people take from my story, it's this. Don't confuse authority with integrity. Just because someone has a title, a rule book, or a clipboard doesn't mean they're right. Sometimes the smallest person in the room, the one without power, without backing, without a voice, is the only one seeing things clearly. And if you're ever in that position, if you ever find yourself cornered by people who think rules are more important than reason, remember this. Paperwork can be forged. Titles can change. But truth doesn't bend. The moment you stand up for it, everything else begins to fall into place. It's been a year now since that day in the county office. The HOA is a memory, the lake is thriving, and the community, the real community, has grown stronger than ever. Sometimes I still find myself walking down to the water at night, the air cool and quiet, the moonlight stretching across the surface like a silver thread, and I think about everything that happened, every letter, every confrontation, every moment I thought I couldn't take another day of it. And then I smile, because somehow, through all that noise, peace found its way back. Not because someone enforced it, but because enough of us finally stopped being afraid to demand it. So, tell me, if your HOA tried to control your land, your home, your peace, would you fight back or would you let them win? When I bought that quiet little piece of land, I thought I was escaping chaos, not stepping straight into it. Within a week, the HOA president was standing at my fence line, clipboard in hand, demanding I explain myself for violating a rule I didn't even know existed. Then came the letters, the fines, and a late-night knocks on my door, all because of a patch of dirt they thought they controlled. But the moment I pulled out the deed and realized what I actually owned, everything changed. Because what started as a simple land purchase turned me into their biggest nightmare. When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like the kind of place people dream about settling down in. Neat lawns, quiet mornings, and neighbors who waved at each other as they drove by. The kind of community that looked perfect on a real estate brochure. After years of city noise and cramped apartments, this little corner of suburbia felt like peace, or at least that's what I thought. My name's Daniel, and for most of my life, I've worked long hours as a contractor. I'd been saving for years to buy a piece of land, not for a mansion or a rental, but just a simple property where I could build something that was mine. So when a small plot on the edge of Willow Creek went up for sale, tucked beside a private lake and a patch of reserve land, I jumped on it. It was quiet, affordable, and technically within the HOA's boundaries, though barely. The first few weeks were blissful. I'd wake up early, step outside with my coffee, and listen to the birds instead of traffic. My closest neighbors, the Carters, were friendly retired folks who offered me lemonade the day I moved in. There were kids riding bikes, dogs being walked, and weekend barbecues that made the neighborhood feel alive but peaceful. I didn't think much about the HOA. They seemed harmless enough, a group of locals who kept things organized. I got a welcome letter, a list of community rules, and a packet that looked like it had been photocopied since the 90s. Most of it was basic stuff. Keep your lawn mowed, no loud music after 9 p.m., and don't park boats on the street. Fair enough. I wasn't even technically using any of the shared amenities, the pool, the tennis court, or the clubhouse, so I figured I'd stay under the radar. I paid the small annual fee and focused on clearing the land and sketching out my building plans. But in places like Willow Creek, peace doesn't always last. It started small, a note taped to my gate one morning. No signature, just a typed message that said, "Your structure must comply with HOA design standards. Please submit plans for approval." It caught me off guard. The only structure on my lot at that time was a small shed I'd built to store tools and equipment. It was simple, made of cedar wood, nothing flashy, and placed entirely within my property lines. Still, the note was clear. Someone was watching. I brushed it off at first. Maybe it was a mix-up. Maybe someone new on the HOA board was just being thorough. But as the days passed, I started to notice the looks. People slowing their cars when passing my lot, whispering near the mailboxes. The friendly smiles from the first week began to fade. Then came the first meeting invitation, hand-delivered by the HOA president herself, a woman named Marjorie Benson. She was the kind of person who carried a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. Her tone was polite, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Daniels, we'd like to discuss your recent property modifications. We just want to make sure everyone follows the community's design harmony standards."